Hi, fourth graders. Today we are going to be thinking about fractions and decimals. Our WALT for today is to write fractions and decimals that name the same number. Throughout our lesson, we are going to be pausing the slide every once in a while. And if we are going to pause, I put a little picture here for you to know that you're going to have to pause and do some work. Before we begin, grab a pencil and a piece of paper, or a pen and a piece of paper, and be ready to do some work on that paper. For this work, for this start problem, we are going to be reading each decimal aloud. So think back to March when you were doing some decimal work and be thinking about how you would read this. Push the space bar or the pause button on your video right now, and I'll be back in a minute to go over the answers with you. All right, well, welcome back to our start problem. To read this, we have 2 digits on the other side of the decimal point, to the right of the decimal point. So we would name this as 35 hundredths. And this one right here, this number has some whole pieces and some decimal pieces. So we would call this number 2 and 7/10. Remember, when we see a decimal, we get to use the word and. Okay, 2 and 7/10, because that is in our tenths place. And finally, we have 6 and 19. What did you say as this last decimal place value? 19 hundredths, because that last digit is in the hundredths place. If you didn't remember that, don't worry, we are going to keep working on that today. Here is our try it problem. We're going to do our 3 reads for this problem, and after we finish, you are going to pause and we will get back together after you do some work to see how you did. A soccer camp has places for 100 students. So far, 60 of the places are filled. Write both a fraction and a decimal in both hundredths and tenths to show the part of the 100 places for students that are filled. What is our problem about? This is the non-math part. What is our problem about? It's about kids going to a soccer camp. And at the soccer camp, we know that there are 100 spaces for students. I'm going to read it again. A soccer camp has places for 100 students. So far, 60 of the places are filled. Write both a fraction and a decimal in both hundredths and tenths to show the part of the 100 places for students that are filled. What are we trying to find out? Let's see. We are trying to find a fraction and a decimal written as a hundredth and as tenths to show the part of the 100 places that are filled. So how many spaces have students signed up for? Finally, a soccer camp has places for 100 students. So far, 60 of the places are filled. Write both a fraction and a decimal in both hundredths and tenths to show the part of the 100 places for students that are filled. So what is important? Well, let's think. What would be important in this? We know that we need to think about fractions and decimals. So we need to think about a fraction and a decimal. We know are parts of a whole. So what's the whole? What's the whole amount of students that can go to the soccer camp? So the whole amount is 100 students can go to this camp. Now what do we already know about these 100 spaces? We know that 60 of them are filled. 60 kids have decided to go to this camp. So go ahead and hit the pause button and see what you can figure out. All right, so we can use a model to figure out how to write hundredths or tenths as a fraction and as a decimal. So our models, remember, are these grids. So in this grid right here, I have 100 little spaces. Okay, so each small square is 1/100th of the whole. So if we go back to our problem, we have 60, we have 60 of the 100 places are filled. And if we go forward, we see that 60 small squares are filled of our 100. And so it's 60 hundredths, which is the same as writing 60 hundredths. All right, let's look at our next one. I'm going to erase that because it's kind of hard to see. Okay. The next one says that we can think about this as each as 1/10 of the whole. Each of these sections is 1/10. There are 6 sections that are shaded. So we have 6/10. Let's think. I have 6 that are shaded out of 10 in my whole place. I want you to think about why we can go between the hundredths and the tenths so easily. Why are we able to go to this model of tenths when we started with this model of hundredths? What do we know about the relationship between 10 and 100? If you're thinking about the fact that in order to get from these tenths to these 100ths, we divide all of these into 10 more spaces, 10 times, then you'd be on the right track. So let's look at a place value chart to help us. This is the place value chart that you have in your classroom. It goes from thousands all the way to our new place values that we're just now learning about, these tenths and hundredths. If we look right here in this spot, we can see that hundredths and tenths are right next to each other on the place value chart. So we know that they have some sort of relationship. You, all the way back in September, talked with your teachers and your classmates about how anytime we are moving in this direction on the place value chart, as when we're getting bigger numbers, we are, every time we jump, let me erase this, I want you to be able to see this. Every time we jump from this side to this side, we go times 10. 10 times bigger. So these tenths are 10 times bigger than these hundredths. And you can see that with your eyes in this picture right here. You really can see that these are 10 times bigger. This long blue line is 10 times bigger than this teeny tiny little dot. I can't even circle it. It's so small. So again, I'm going to erase this ink here. So we can use a place value chart to understand how to write hundredths or tenths as a decimal. So this is just thinking about how many tenths are in that problem and how many hundredths. So if I have 60 hundredths, when I write it on my place value chart, this is what it's going to look like. That is what it's going to look like. So I want us to go back to this one. So how would we write this 60 hundredths as a decimal? Well, it's got our decimal point and then 60 hundredths. We can write that as a decimal with tenths by thinking about this, how this is 6/10, which is the same thing as 6/10. Because again, in our place value chart, we know that these two place values are what we're looking at. Okay, so if the thinking, how does the decimal place relate to the equivalent fraction? So if the denominator is a fraction of 10, the equivalent decimal is how many places after the decimal point? Well, here's our decimal point right here. How many places is it after if it's in the, it has a tenth as our denominator? It's one place past the decimal point. Well, what if I have a number that is that has a decimal, excuse me, a fraction of 100 as the denominator? Well, then how many places is that past our decimal point? 1, 2 places past our decimal point. So now we're going to do this one, thinking about how to write this number as a decimal. So the first thing I'm thinking is this is a special one because it's a mixed number, and we know that mixed numbers have pieces of, we have whole parts and we have the fractional parts. So this whole part is a 7. And what is going to go between our fraction pieces or our decimal pieces and our whole numbers? What's that new symbol we learned is our decimal point. So that's going to go right here. And I need to write this as this 9/10 as a decimal. So if I think back, we know it's in the tenths place. So we know it's going to be one place past the decimal point. So it's going to be 9/10. I know that I have my ones place, the decimal point, then my tenths, and then my hundredths. Okay, this is my place value chart. Okay, I know that that's what it is. So I want you to look at this one, write a decimal equivalent to 2/10, and you can attempt to draw a fraction model as well. Okay, 2/10. You can hit the space bar, pause right here, and do your work. Okay, so I'm hoping that you got to this decimal, 2/10. Because once again, if we think about that place value chart, we're one place past the decimal point. All right, write a decimal equivalent to 83 hundredths. Show your work. Again, you are going to pause. You're going to work on this problem, and you are going to grab a picture of that and send it to your teacher. If it's easier for you to type this out and send it and share the document with your teacher, go ahead and feel free to do that as well. All right, if you have any questions, please let your teacher know, and I'll talk to you all soon.